The photograph arrived at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. on a Tuesday morning in November 1975, and it stopped everyone who saw it cold. The image showed a black man standing in full Ku Klux Klan regalia, white robe, pointed hood, the works, surrounded by a dozen armed Klansmen at a nighttime rally in rural Alabama. His face was visible, calm and composed, while Confederate flags burned in the background and rifles gleamed in the firelight. The man's name was Ron Stallworth, and he was about to pull off one of the most audacious undercover operations in FBI history. Except Ron Stallworth wasn't FBI. Not yet. He was a local police detective in Colorado Springs, who'd just done something so insane, so impossibly dangerous, that when he pitched it to his superiors, they thought he was joking. He'd joined the Ku Klux Klan over the phone while being black, and somehow, through a combination of brilliant improvisation, fearless deception, and sheer audacity, he'd convinced the KKK leadership that he was a passionate white supremacist ready to commit violence for the cause. For nearly a year, Stallworth maintained two identities. On the phone, he was a hate-filled racist recruit, rising through Klan ranks. In person, a white undercover officer attended meetings in his place, while Stallworth fed him every detail of his fake life story. The operation exposed terrorist plots, prevented bombings, and revealed that KKK members included active-duty military personnel with access to explosives and automatic weapons. By the time it ended, Stallworth had become personal friends with David Duke, the grand wizard of the KKK himself, who called him regularly to discuss strategy and praised him as one of the organization's most promising young members. Duke had no idea he was confiding in a black detective who was documenting every word for law enforcement. This is the story of how one man's voice, quick thinking, and unshakable nerve infiltrated America's most notorious hate group and exposed its secrets from the inside. Ron Stallworth became the first black detective in Colorado Springs Police Department history in 1978, and from day one, he knew he was operating in hostile territory. Colorado Springs was overwhelmingly white, conservative, and not particularly welcoming to integration. The police department had hired him as a token diversity hire after civil rights lawsuits, and many of his fellow officers made it clear they didn't want him there. He endured slurs, was excluded from social gatherings, and knew that some of the men who were supposed to have his back on dangerous calls would gladly watch him fail. But Stallworth wasn't interested in just surviving. He wanted to prove himself as an investigator, and when his chief assigned him to the intelligence division monitoring extremist groups, he saw his opportunity. The intelligence unit tracked various organizations, militant black separatists, anti-government militias, and white supremacist groups that were experiencing a resurgence in the late 1970s. One morning in early 1979, Stallworth was reading the local newspaper when he spotted a small classified advertisement that made him stop cold. It was a recruitment notice for the local Ku Klux Klan chapter, listing a P.O. box address and inviting patriots to join the fight to preserve white Christian America. Most people would have filed this away as background intelligence. Stallworth had a different reaction. He decided to respond to the ad, as himself, using his real name. Looking back, even Stallworth admits the initial decision was partly impulse, partly curiosity, and partly a middle finger to the racists who'd made his professional life miserable. He sat down at his desk and handwrote a letter expressing enthusiastic interest in joining the Klan. He claimed to be a white man disgusted by the federal government's integration policies, angry about affirmative action programs, and ready to take action to preserve white heritage. He signed it Ron Stallworth and dropped it in the mail. Then he waited. 3 weeks later, his office phone rang. The voice on the other end was friendly, folksy, with a thick Southern accent. The man introduced himself as Ken Odell, the local Klan organizer, and said he'd received Ron's letter. He wanted to know more about this passionate young patriot who seemed so committed to the cause. Stallworth should have panicked. He should have made an excuse and hung up. Instead, something extraordinary happened. He slipped into character as naturally as breathing. Speaking in his own voice, the voice of a black man, Stallworth began spinning an elaborate persona of a racist white man who hated minorities, feared race mixing, and blamed Jewish conspiracies for America's problems. He peppered his speech with racial slurs that made him physically ill to say. He spoke about his concerns that the whites were losing control of the country. He referenced conspiracies and talking points he'd memorized from intelligence reports on extremist literature, and Ken Odell bought every word. The conversation lasted 30 minutes. By the end, Odell was enthusiastic about Ron's potential as a Klan recruit. He invited Stallworth to meet in person at a local bar to discuss membership. Stallworth hung up the phone, his heart hammering, and immediately realized the enormous problem he'd created. He could maintain this fiction on the phone where no one could see him, but he couldn't exactly show up to a Klan meeting in person. That's when the plan took shape. Stallworth pitched his idea to his supervisor. He would continue handling all phone conversations with the Klan as Ron Stallworth, white supremacist. But for in-person meetings, they'd send in another detective, a white officer who would pose as Ron Stallworth in the flesh. It would require perfect coordination, flawless communication, and two men maintaining the exact same elaborate backstory without contradicting each other. One slip would expose them both and likely get the undercover officer killed. His supervisor approved it. The white detective they assigned was named Chuck, a veteran investigator with experience in undercover work. Stallworth and Chuck spent days crafting the Ron Stallworth persona in exhaustive detail, where he grew up, his family background, his work history. His military service. They decided Ron had served in Vietnam and come home radicalized by seeing racial integration in the military. They rehearsed mannerisms, speech patterns, and opinions on dozens of political topics. Chuck would memorize everything Stallworth told the Klan over the phone, and Stallworth would learn everything Chuck experienced at in-person meetings. They would become the same person, split across two bodies. The first in-person meeting was at a dive bar on the outskirts of Colorado Springs. Chuck walked in wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, playing the part of a working-class white guy, tired of social changes he didn't understand. Ken Odell was there with two other Klan members, drinking beer and sizing up the new recruit. They asked Chuck questions designed to test his authenticity, questions about where he'd grown up, why he wanted to join, whether he was willing to take action if the organization required it. Chuck answered flawlessly, channeling everything he and Stallworth had prepared. He dropped the right names, referenced the right conspiracy theories, and showed the appropriate level of angry conviction without seeming unstable or suspicious. The Klansmen warmed to him. They shared their own stories of racial resentment and fears about changing demographics. They talked about plans for recruitment drives and cross-burnings. And at the end of the night, Ken Odell told Chuck he was exactly the kind of man the Klan needed. He invited him to attend a formal meeting the following week, where he could be officially inducted into the organization. Chuck called Stallworth from a payphone the moment he left the bar, and the two men compared notes for an hour, building out more details of their shared identity. This was actually working, but the operation was about to get exponentially more complicated. 2 days after Chuck's meeting with the local Klan, Ron Stallworth's office phone rang again. The voice on the other end was smooth, educated, media-trained. The man introduced himself as David Duke, Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the largest and most organized faction of the KKK nationwide. Duke explained that Ken Odell had sent Ron Stallworth's initial letter to national headquarters, and Duke personally wanted to welcome him to the organization. He'd been impressed by Ron's articulate passion and wanted to stay in personal contact as Ron rose through the ranks. This was simultaneously the best and worst thing that could happen to the operation. Duke was the public face of the modern Klan, a former Louisiana state legislator who'd worked to rebrand the KKK as a respectable political organization rather than a terrorist group. He gave television interviews, published newsletters, and had ambitions for national political office. Getting access to Duke meant accessing the inner workings of the entire national Klan apparatus. It also meant that if anything about Ron Stallworth's identity didn't check out, the exposure wouldn't just come from local members. It would come from the top of the organization, with resources to investigate suspicious recruits. Duke asked Stallworth detailed questions about his background. Stallworth, sitting at his desk in the Colorado Springs Police Department Intelligence Office, responded with the confidence of a man who'd been building this character for weeks. He complained about forced busing and integration policies. He ranted about Jewish control of media and banking. He expressed frustration that good white Americans weren't standing up for their heritage. Duke was delighted. He told Stallworth he had leadership potential, that men with his intelligence and passion were exactly what the Klan needed to achieve mainstream political acceptance. Over the following months, Duke called Stallworth regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes multiple times in a single week. The Grand Wizard of the KKK, a man who preached white supremacy to thousands of followers, would call a black police detective and discuss Klan strategy for 30, 40, sometimes 60 minutes at a stretch. Duke shared his political ambitions. He complained about Klan members who were too violent and undermined his efforts at respectability. He discussed fundraising, recruitment techniques, and media strategy. He asked for Stallworth's opinion on tactical decisions. Stallworth took notes on everything and filed intelligence reports after each conversation, documenting Duke's admissions about the organization's activities and members. The irony was so profound that Stallworth sometimes had to mute his phone to keep from laughing. Meanwhile, Chuck was attending Klan meetings in person, going deeper into the organization. He participated in firearms training sessions where members practiced shooting while wearing hoods. He attended cross-burnings where speakers ranted about race war and government conspiracies. He met Klansmen who worked as police officers, military personnel, and security contractors. People with access to weapons, explosives, and classified information who were planning domestic terrorism under the cover of white supremacist ideology. And every few days, Chuck would call Stallworth and download everything he'd learned. And Stallworth would brief Chuck on his latest conversations with Duke, ensuring their stories remained perfectly aligned. The closest call came during a Klan security check 4 months into the operation. One of the local members, a paranoid conspiracy theorist named Frank, became suspicious that the organization might have been infiltrated. He proposed voice printing everyone's phone conversations and comparing them to their in-person speech patterns to verify identities. Stallworth's voice and Chuck's voice were nothing alike. Stallworth's was higher-pitched and reflected his urban upbringing, while Chuck's was deeper with rural inflections they'd adopted for the character. If the Klan actually did voice analysis, the operation would be immediately exposed. Stallworth had to think fast. During his next call with David Duke, he casually mentioned hearing about the voice printing proposal and said he thought it was a waste of time and resources that would scare off potential recruits who valued privacy. Duke agreed. He told Stallworth that Frank was an overreactive hothead, and Duke personally shut down the security check proposal. Ron Stallworth, a black detective, had just convinced the Grand Wizard of the KKK to cancel a security measure that would have exposed him. The operation continued without interruption, but the intelligence Stallworth and Chuck were gathering had become increasingly alarming. They learned that several Klan members were active-duty military personnel stationed at Fort Carson, just outside Colorado Springs. These members had access to military explosives, weapons, and training. They were discussing bombing gay bars, black churches, and synagogues. This wasn't just racist rhetoric. These were actionable terrorist plots being planned by people with the skills and resources to execute them. Stallworth took his findings to his superiors and requested permission to expand the investigation. With FBI cooperation, they began monitoring the military personnel involved with the Klan, documenting conversations about acquiring C4 explosives and identifying potential targets. The investigation revealed a much larger network than anyone had suspected. Klan members in law enforcement, military, and private security across multiple states, all connected through Duke's organization. Some were simply racist bigots who attended meetings to feel part of a community. Others were actively planning violence. The challenge was building prosecutable cases without exposing the undercover operation. Then came the invitation that made everything even more surreal. David Duke personally invited Ron Stallworth to meet him at a Klan rally and conference in Colorado. Duke would be the keynote speaker, and he wanted to finally meet in person this promising young Klansman he'd been mentoring over the phone for months. Chuck would obviously attend in person as Ron Stallworth, but the logistics were becoming absurdly complicated. Stallworth would need to brief Chuck on every personal detail Duke might reference from their phone conversations. Stories Stallworth had told, opinions he'd expressed, inside jokes they'd developed. Chuck would essentially be playing a character that two people had created, meeting the author of the character's worldview face to face. The night of the rally arrived. Chuck, dressed in jeans and a casual shirt, deliberately avoiding anything too formal or too casual that might seem out of character. He drove to the event location, a rented hall outside Colorado Springs, where approximately 50 Klan members gathered in various states of regalia. Some wore full robes and hoods, others wore street clothes with Klan insignia pins. Armed security patrolled the perimeter, checking IDs against a pre-approved list. Chuck's fake ID identified him as Ron Stallworth. He was waved through. Inside, David Duke was holding court, shaking hands and greeting members. When Ken Odell introduced Chuck as Ron Stallworth, Duke's face lit up with recognition. He embraced Chuck like an old friend, talking about their phone conversations as if recalling shared memories. Chuck responded perfectly, referencing details only Stallworth would know. Duke praised Ron's dedication and hinted at leadership opportunities. For 20 minutes, Chuck stood chatting with the Grand Wizard while the real Ron Stallworth sat in an unmarked police car 2 blocks away, monitoring the operation through a wire Chuck wore under his shirt. Stallworth listened to Duke's voice, the same voice he'd heard dozens of times over the phone, now speaking to his surrogate in person. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. But what Stallworth was about to witness made the entire operation worthwhile. During Duke's keynote speech, he outlined the Klan's political strategy for achieving mainstream acceptance and influencing elections. He talked about running candidates for local office, infiltrating community organizations, and recruiting members from respectable professions, teachers, doctors, businessmen, who could spread Klan ideology without the stigma of hoods and cross burnings. He specifically mentioned Colorado Springs as a model for successful recruitment because several members held positions in law enforcement and military. Duke was openly admitting to a strategy of infiltrating institutions with white supremacists. Every word was being recorded. After the rally, Chuck participated in a smaller, private meeting with Duke and local leadership. This is where the conversation turned explicitly to violence. Members discussed ongoing investigations into their activities and how to avoid law enforcement attention. They talked about which targets were soft, meaning unprotected and easy to attack, and which would send the strongest message. They debated whether bombing a synagogue would generate too much media attention and bring federal scrutiny. One member suggested a cross burning on the lawn of a local NAACP office as a warning that wouldn't technically be violent. Duke listened to all of this and offered tactical advice on timing and messaging. He didn't explicitly order violence, but he guided the strategic discussion like a CEO chairing a board meeting about quarterly objectives. His goal was clear: maintain plausible deniability while enabling local chapters to intimidate minority communities through terrorism. Chuck extracted himself from the meeting after 2 hours, claiming he had an early work shift the next morning. He drove directly to meet Stallworth, and they spent the rest of the night transcribing everything from the recording and writing a comprehensive intelligence report. The evidence they'd gathered documented a nationwide conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism and interfere with civil rights. The FBI raid came 3 weeks later, coordinated across 4 states simultaneously. Federal agents arrested 9 Klan members on various charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to illegal weapons possession. The military personnel were court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. Several local Klan leaders faced terrorism charges. David Duke was never directly charged. He'd been careful to maintain distance from explicit violence, but the FBI opened formal investigations into his organization that would plague him for years. The Colorado Springs Klan chapter effectively dissolved overnight. But the most dramatic confrontation came during the arrest of Ken Odell, the local organizer who'd first welcomed Ron Stallworth into the Klan. When FBI agents showed up at his door with arrest warrants, they were accompanied by Ron Stallworth in person, wearing his Colorado Springs Police Department badge. Odell's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally rage as he realized the truth. The Ron Stallworth he'd been talking to on the phone for months, the passionate white supremacist he'd vouched for to his superiors, had been a black detective the entire time. He'd been played thoroughly and completely. Odell screamed racial slurs as agents led him away in handcuffs, but Stallworth just stood there quietly, watching the man who'd welcomed him into a terrorist organization get exactly what he deserved. David Duke learned the truth through media reports after the arrests became public. He immediately went on television claiming the FBI had manufactured evidence and that he'd suspected Ron Stallworth might be a fake identity all along. This was an obvious lie. Duke's phone records showed he'd called Stallworth voluntarily, repeatedly, even after the investigation became public knowledge. But the damage to Duke's credibility was catastrophic. He'd positioned himself as the smart, media-savvy face of a rebranded Klan that used intelligence instead of violence. Now the world knew he'd been completely fooled by an undercover operative whose race he never suspected despite months of conversation. Conservative media outlets that had given Duke sympathetic platforms distanced themselves. Mainstream political figures who'd courted Klan voters suddenly treated Duke as toxic. His plans for political office stalled. Years later, Duke would run for governor of Louisiana and lose badly, in part because opponents aired recordings from the Stallworth investigation showing Duke coaching members on domestic terrorism tactics. The man who'd tried to make white supremacy respectable had been exposed as just another hate group leader enabling violence, and it had all unraveled because Ron Stallworth decided to answer a classified ad in the newspaper and lie his way into the organization's inner circle using nothing but his voice and his brain. The operation officially lasted 11 months, from Stallworth's first phone call with Ken Odell to the FBI raids that dismantled the Colorado Springs Klan chapter. During that time, Stallworth and Chuck prevented at least 3 planned bombings, identified over 24 Klan members in positions of institutional authority, and generated intelligence that fed into dozens of FBI investigations nationwide. Stallworth received commendations from federal law enforcement and was promoted within the Colorado Springs Police Department. Chuck returned to regular investigative work, though he later admitted in interviews that the psychological toll of pretending to be a white supremacist for nearly a year had been severe. He'd attended rallies where speakers called for violence against people who looked like his own neighbors and friends. He'd laughed at racist jokes that made him sick. He'd stood next to armed men who would have killed him without hesitation if they'd known he was a cop. For both Stallworth and Chuck, the operation required a kind of psychological compartmentalization that most people can't achieve. They had to become people they despised, maintain those personas flawlessly under constant scrutiny, and never break character even when hearing the most vile expressions of hatred imaginable. One mistake would have meant exposure, and exposure would have likely meant death. The Klan didn't forgive infiltrators. They made examples of them. But what makes Stallworth's operation particularly remarkable isn't just the danger or the successful prosecution of terrorists. It's the sheer audacity of the con itself. Stallworth fooled these men using the one tool they claimed to be able to identify with perfect accuracy: his voice. White supremacist ideology insists that racial differences are fundamental, obvious, innate. Racists claim they can identify someone's race by how they speak, move, or think. The entire foundation of their belief system rests on the idea that race creates unbridgeable differences between people. Ron Stallworth proved that was complete nonsense. Using nothing but carefully chosen words and understanding of racist psychology, a black man convinced dozens of white supremacists that he was one of them. He didn't disguise his voice. He didn't use an accent. He just spoke with confidence and authority. And the racists heard exactly what they expected to hear because their ideology blinded them to reality. David Duke, who built his entire career on claims of racial superiority and the ability to identify threats to white America, developed a warm, personal friendship with a black detective and never suspected the truth. The Grand Wizard of the KKK was outsmarted by the very racial group he claimed was intellectually inferior. The irony is so perfect, it almost seems like fiction. Stallworth went public with his story decades later after retiring from law enforcement. His memoir, Black Klansman, was published in 2014 and became the basis for Spike Lee's 2018 film Black Klansman, which won critical acclaim and brought the story to mainstream audiences. But the film, for all its drama, actually downplays some of the operation's most remarkable aspects. The real investigation lasted longer, was more complex, and required more precise coordination than any movie could fully capture. Stallworth and Chuck weren't Hollywood heroes with unlimited resources and backup. They were two cops in a medium-sized police department, running an operation that could have gotten them killed if anyone made a single mistake, working with minimal support and often facing skepticism from colleagues who thought the whole thing was too risky or too ridiculous to succeed. They pulled it off through meticulous preparation, extraordinary discipline, and a shared commitment to exposing domestic terrorism regardless of personal risk. Today, Stallworth speaks publicly about his experiences, often to law enforcement and civil rights groups. He's asked frequently about what the operation taught him. His answer is always the same. Hate groups like the Klan survive because they operate in darkness, because they're taken seriously by too few people until violence actually occurs, and because institutional racism provides them cover within law enforcement and military organizations. The solution isn't just arresting terrorists after they act. It's infiltrating these groups, understanding their psychology, and dismantling their networks before violence happens. And it requires people willing to confront hatred directly, even when it's uncomfortable, dangerous, or seemingly impossible. The Colorado Springs Klan chapter never recovered from the FBI raids. Some members scattered to other organizations. Some abandoned extremism entirely after facing legal consequences. A few went to prison, but the ideology didn't disappear. It just moved online, fragmented into smaller groups, and adapted its recruitment tactics. David Duke continues to promote white supremacist ideology through websites and social media, though he's largely been relegated to the fringes of political discourse. He never publicly acknowledged being fooled by Stallworth, preferring to dismiss the entire operation as government persecution rather than admit he'd been completely deceived. That denial is perhaps the most satisfying part of the story's legacy. A man who built his identity on racial superiority was humiliated by a black detective who outthought him at every turn. And because Duke's ego won't allow him to admit what happened, he's forced to live with the cognitive dissonance forever. Ron Stallworth, meanwhile, stands as proof that intelligence, courage, and dedication to justice matter infinitely more than race, that the confidence to walk into the lion's den, armed with nothing but your wits, can change history. He made one phone call that should have ended in disaster. Instead, it exposed a terrorist network, prevented violence, and proved that white supremacists' greatest weakness is their own ideology. A worldview so disconnected from reality that they couldn't recognize the truth, even when it was speaking to them directly. That's not just a successful investigation, that's poetic justice.